The federal courthouse in Fresno, California, stood as a monument to order and authority, its granite facade gleaming faintly under a gray, rain-soaked sky. Inside Courtroom 7B, the air was thick with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of papers. It was a routine morning, the kind that judges, clerks, and reporters had come to expect. Predictable, procedural, and uneventful. But that was about to change. Rain tapped lightly against the tall windows, the sound almost rhythmic, like a metronome marking time. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her glasses and sorted through a stack of documents. Reporters sat in the gallery, bored but alert, their cameras resting on their laps. They sipped coffee from paper cups, the steam rising in faint wisps, and exchanged quiet small talk. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, stood near the door, his eyes scanning the room with practiced vigilance. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Deirdre Colton sat at her bench, her sharp features framed by a cascade of dark hair streaked with silver. She was known for her precision, her no-nonsense attitude, and her unwavering commitment to the rule of law. Her reputation preceded her. High-profile defendants, corporate executives, and even seasoned attorneys had felt the weight of her scrutiny. She was not a woman to be trifled with, and her courtroom reflected that. Every surface was immaculate, every movement deliberate. Even the way she adjusted her glasses seemed to carry an air of authority. The case on the docket that morning was one that had already garnered some attention, though not enough to draw a crowd. Elon Musk, the billionaire CEO of multiple high-profile companies, had been summoned to appear before Judge Colton for allegedly violating a court gag order. The charge was straightforward. During a press event weeks prior, Musk had disclosed details from a sealed corporate litigation hearing involving one of his companies. It was a breach of protocol, clear and simple, or so it seemed. The door to the courtroom creaked open, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Elon Musk walked in alone, his presence immediately altering the energy of the room. He wore a gray suit and a dark tie, his expression unreadable. There was no entourage, no security detail, no team of high-priced attorneys trailing behind him. Just Musk, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his posture relaxed but deliberate. He moved with a quiet confidence, as if he were entering a boardroom rather than a federal courtroom. The reporters straightened in their seats, their boredom evaporating in an instant. Cameras were raised, and the soft clicks of shutters filled the air. Musk's appearance was unexpected, not because he was there, but because of how he was there. Alone, unflinching, almost indifferent to the gravity of the situation. Judge Colton looked up from her notes, her sharp eyes meeting Musk's for a brief moment. There was no warmth in her gaze, no hint of curiosity. She was a woman who had seen it all, celebrities, moguls, and power players who thought they were above the law. Musk was just another name on her docket, another defendant to be held accountable. "Mr. Musk," she began, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You have been found in violation of federal court orders relating to sealed testimony. The fine is $3.2 million, to be paid within 14 days. There were no gasps, no dramatic pauses. This was, after all, Elon Musk, a man whose name was synonymous with innovation, controversy, and unimaginable wealth. A $3.2 million fine was, for him, little more than a rounding error. The reporters scribbled in their notebooks, their pens scratching against paper, but the room remained eerily quiet. Musk stood still, his hands now folded in front of him, his expression unchanged. He didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't even blink. It was as if the judge's words had rolled off him like water off a duck's back. But there was something about his stillness, something about the way he held himself, that suggested this wasn't the end of the story. Judge Colton leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Do you understand the terms of the judgment?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for ambiguity. Musk nodded, his voice calm and measured. "I do," he said, "but I'd like to respond now." The room seemed to hold its breath. Heads turned, and the reporters exchanged quick glances. This was unusual. Defendants didn't respond in federal courtrooms, not like this, not without their attorneys. Musk's request was a deviation from the norm, a crack in the facade of predictability that had defined the morning. Judge Colton raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice tinged with caution, "I strongly recommend legal representation before you proceed." Musk's response was immediate, his tone respectful but firm. "With respect, Your Honor, I think it's more appropriate that I handle this personally." The judge studied him for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the bench. She was a woman who valued order, who believed in the sanctity of the legal process. But she was also a pragmatist, and she could see that Musk wasn't going to back down. Finally, she gave a slow nod. "Proceed," she said. Musk reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was neatly folded, unassuming, almost mundane. He placed it on the table in front of him, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The room watched in silence, the tension palpable. "I'm not disputing what I said publicly," Musk began, his voice steady and clear. "But I am disputing whether the gag order applied in the context it was used." The statement hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in calm precision. Judge Colton's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest hint of surprise. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her, and waited for him to continue. Musk's argument was methodical, his words carefully chosen. He referenced Section 35B of the Protective Hearing Order, specifically subsection 35B3, which allowed for public safety exceptions. He explained that his comments had been intended to address potential risks to consumers and shareholders, not to breach confidentiality. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture dramatically, didn't try to grandstand. He simply laid out his case, point by point, like a professor delivering a lecture. The courtroom, which had been quiet before, was now utterly silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. The bailiff, who had been standing near the door, shifted his weight slightly, his eyes fixed on Musk. It was as if the entire room had been caught off guard, not by the content of Musk's argument, but by the way he delivered it, calm, confident, and utterly unshakable. Judge Colton listened intently, her expression inscrutable. When Musk finished, she leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing. "Are you suggesting," she asked, her voice measured, "that you're protected under federal whistleblower statutes?" Musk didn't hesitate. "I'm saying," he replied, "that the fine being levied against me may contradict precedent set in Stansfield v. U.S. Tech Holdings, 9th Circuit, 2004, where the court ruled that executive disclosures serving a public interest cannot be penalized under seal protection if the statements fall outside the original parameters of the gag." The room seemed to collectively exhale. It wasn't just the legal jargon, though that was impressive enough. It was the way Musk delivered it, like he belonged in that courtroom, like he had every right to be there, challenging the system on its own terms. Judge Colton didn't respond immediately. She sat back in her chair, her fingertips pressed together, her gaze fixed on Musk. For a long moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the occasional tap of a reporter's laptop keys. Then, finally, she spoke. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you realize that referencing precedent in this courtroom doesn't guarantee exemption. This isn't a theoretical argument. This is a federal penalty." Musk nodded, his expression unchanged. "I'm aware," he said, "but it's not theoretical if the penalty itself ignores its own framework." The words landed like a hammer, their impact reverberating through the room. It wasn't just what Musk said, it was how he said it. There was no anger, no defiance, just a quiet certainty that seemed to cut through the noise. The courtroom, which had been a stage for procedure and protocol, suddenly felt like a battlefield, and Musk was holding his ground. Judge Colton exhaled slowly, her eyes never leaving Musk's. "I'll take this under advisement," she said finally. "We'll reconvene in 24 hours for final ruling. Until then, no further statements to the media." Musk nodded again, his demeanor unchanged. "Understood," he said. As the judge stood and left the bench, the room erupted into a low murmur. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, their fingers flying over their keyboards. Legal analysts whispered to each other, their voices tinged with excitement. Even the bailiff, who had seen it all, looked slightly stunned. Musk, for his part, remained calm. He gathered his single sheet of paper, folded it neatly, and returned it to his jacket pocket. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floor. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear. But inside Courtroom 7B, the storm was just beginning. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, as if the air itself is holding its breath. All eyes were on Elon Musk as he stood at the defendant's table, a single sheet of paper resting in front of him. The room, which had been a stage for routine legal proceedings just moments ago, now felt like an arena. The stakes were high, not just for Musk but for the system itself. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about principles, about the boundaries of authority, and about who gets to define them. Judge Deirdre Colton sat at her bench, her sharp eyes fixed on Musk. She had seen countless defendants in her career, some defiant, some remorseful, some arrogantly dismissive. But Musk was different. He wasn't angry, wasn't pleading, wasn't trying to charm his way out of trouble. He was calm, almost unnervingly so, like a chess player who had already calculated every possible move. "Proceed," Judge Colton said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Musk nodded slightly, his hands resting lightly on the table. He began to speak, his voice steady and measured, each word deliberate. "I'm not disputing what I said publicly," he said, "but I am disputing whether the gag order applied in the context it was used." The statement hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in calm precision. Judge Colton's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest hint of surprise. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her, and waited for him to continue. Musk reached for the sheet of paper in front of him, unfolding it with deliberate care. He didn't rush, didn't fumble. Every movement was calculated, as if he were performing a well-rehearsed routine. He glanced at the paper briefly, then looked up, his gaze meeting Judge Colton's. "The order referenced in the contempt filing," he began, "was tied to Section 35B of the protective hearing order issued on March 11th. However, according to subsection 35B3, public safety exceptions permit disclosures under federal fair use exceptions, especially when the disclosed content refers to stockholder-impacting risks." The room seemed to collectively exhale. It wasn't just the legal jargon, though that was impressive enough. It was the way Musk delivered it, like he belonged in that courtroom, like he had every right to be there, challenging the system on its own terms. Judge Colton's eyebrows lifted slightly, a subtle but unmistakable reaction. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the bench. "Are you suggesting," she asked, her voice measured, "that you're protected under federal whistleblower statutes?" Musk didn't hesitate. "I'm saying," he replied, "that the fine being levied against me may contradict precedent set in Stansfield v. U.S. Tech Holdings, 9th Circuit, 2004, where the court ruled that executive disclosures serving a public interest cannot be penalized under seal protection if the statements fall outside the original parameters of the gag." The room was utterly silent now, the tension so thick it felt almost tangible. Even the reporters, who had been typing furiously just moments ago, had stopped, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. The bailiff, who had been standing near the door, shifted his weight slightly, his eyes fixed on Musk. It was as if the entire room had been caught off guard, not by the content of Musk's argument, but by the way he delivered it, calm, confident, and utterly unshakable. Judge Colton didn't respond immediately. She sat back in her chair, her fingertips pressed together, her gaze fixed on Musk. For a long moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the occasional tap of a reporter's laptop keys. Then, finally, she spoke. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you realize that referencing precedent in this courtroom doesn't guarantee exemption. This isn't a theoretical argument. This is a federal penalty." Musk nodded, his expression unchanged. "I'm aware," he said, "but it's not theoretical if the penalty itself ignores its own framework." The words landed like a hammer, their impact reverberating through the room. It wasn't just what Musk said. It was how he said it. There was no anger, no defiance, just a quiet certainty that seemed to cut through the noise. The courtroom, which had been a stage for procedure and protocol, suddenly felt like a battlefield, and Musk was holding his ground. Judge Colton exhaled slowly, her eyes never leaving Musk's. "I'll take this under advisement," she said finally. "We'll reconvene in 24 hours for a final ruling. Until then, no further statements to the media." Musk nodded again, his demeanor unchanged. "Understood," he said. As the judge stood and left the bench, the room erupted into a low murmur. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, their fingers flying over their keyboards. Legal analysts whispered to each other, their voices tinged with excitement. Even the bailiff, who had seen it all, looked slightly stunned. Musk, for his part, remained calm. He gathered his single sheet of paper, folded it neatly, and returned it to his jacket pocket. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floor. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear. But inside Courtroom 7B, the storm was just beginning. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as Musk continued to dismantle the case against him. He handed Judge Colton a printed copy of the March 11th order, pointing to the exception clause on pages 3 and 4. Colton, though skeptical, reviewed the document carefully. Musk's calm demeanor and logical arguments forced her to reconsider the penalty. She adjourned the hearing, requesting additional time to review the materials and consult with legal advisors. Outside the courtroom, the story began to spread. Journalists tweeted fragments of Musk's self-representation, and legal analysts speculated on the implications. By the time the hearing reconvened, the gallery was packed, and the case had become a national conversation. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Courtroom 7B, casting long, golden beams across the polished wooden floors. The room, which had been a stage for tension and drama the day before, now felt charged with anticipation. The gallery was packed, every seat filled with reporters, legal analysts, and curious onlookers. The air was thick with the hum of whispered conversations and the occasional click of a camera shutter. Everyone was waiting for one thing: the final ruling. Elon Musk entered the courtroom at precisely 9:55 a.m., his demeanor as calm and composed as it had been the day before. He wore the same gray suit, the same dark tie, and the same unreadable expression. He took his seat at the defendant's table, his hands resting lightly on the surface in front of him. He didn't glance at the gallery, didn't check his phone, didn't fidget. He simply sat there, waiting. At exactly 10 a.m., Judge Deirdre Colton entered the courtroom. The room fell silent as she took her seat at the bench, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She carried a yellow legal pad, its pages filled with notes, and a folder containing the transcripts and legal precedents that had been the focus of the previous day's hearing. She placed the folder on the bench in front of her and adjusted her glasses, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This court has reviewed the materials presented yesterday and has conferred with a panel of legal advisors from within the district. After careful consideration, I am prepared to deliver the final ruling." The room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was on Judge Colton, every ear tuned to her words. Musk sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Elon Musk's actions, Judge Colton began, did violate the spirit of courtroom protocol, particularly with regard to preserving confidentiality. However, the penalty initially assigned may have overreached the authority granted by the framework outlined in Section 35B. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, their pens poised over their notebooks. Legal analysts exchanged quick glances, their minds already racing to parse the implications of the judge's words. Judge Colton continued, her voice steady and measured. Mr. Musk's reading of the exception clause, as well as his reference to Stansfield v. U.S. Tech Holdings, were accurate. While this court does not make a habit of overturning its own penalties, lightly the room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, their fingers flying over their keyboards. Legal analysts whispered to each other, their voices tinged with excitement. Even the bailiff, who had seen it all, looked slightly stunned. Musk, for his part, remained calm. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't show any outward sign of relief or triumph. He simply looked at Judge Colton and said, "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Colton held up a hand, silencing the room. "I want to make something clear," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "This court is not granting you a pass because of your wealth or public status. You earned this reconsideration because you came in prepared, respectful, and precise. That doesn't happen often, but it matters." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Musk nodded slightly, acknowledging the judge's statement, but saying nothing more. Judge Colton closed her binder and stood. "Court is adjourned," she said, her voice firm and final. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floor. The gallery erupted into motion as reporters rushed for the exit, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Legal analysts lingered, discussing the implications of the ruling. Musk remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly on the table in front of him. Then, calmly and deliberately, he gathered his things and stood. The morning after the ruling, the world was already writing its own version of the story. Headlines blared across newspapers, websites, and social media platforms, each one trying to capture the essence of what had happened in Courtroom 7B. Elon Musk challenges court fine, walks out with a win. Read one. Judge revises ruling after Musk's self-defense shakes the room. Declared another. Pundits and legal analysts dissected every word, every gesture, every nuance of the hearing, turning it into a national conversation. But for Elon Musk, the man at the center of it all, life went on. He returned to work as if nothing had happened, his focus shifting back to the myriad projects that demanded his attention. Yet something had changed. The way people looked at him, the way they spoke to him, it was different. He wasn't just a billionaire CEO anymore. He was the guy who had stood in a federal courtroom and, by sheer force of logic and restraint, made a judge think twice. The public reaction was immediate and intense. In coffee shops, offices, and living rooms across the country, people debated what had happened. Was Musk a genius who had outsmarted the system? Or was he just another example of the rich playing by different rules? Did his victory show that courts were bendable if you were powerful enough? Or did it prove that truth could still sway even the most rigid systems? On social media, the debate raged. Memes circulated, comparing Musk to courtroom drama heroes like Atticus Finch or Harvey Specter. Hashtags like hashtag Fresno Defense and hashtag Musk versus the system trended for days. Some hailed him as a hero, a man who had stood up to authority and won. Others criticized him, accusing him of staging the whole thing for publicity or using his wealth and influence to manipulate the legal system. But amidst the noise, there was a quieter, more profound reaction. For many, Musk's courtroom performance was a reminder that the system, for all its flaws, could still be challenged. It was a story of preparation, precision, and quiet defiance, a story that resonated with people from all walks of life. In legal circles, the ruling sent shockwaves. Law schools added the transcript of Musk's hearing to their curricula, using it as a case study in legal strategy and courtroom etiquette. Professors dissected his arguments, praising his use of precedent and his ability to remain calm under pressure. The phrase Fresno defense entered the lexicon, shorthand for a defendant who flips a courtroom using the system's own tools. Judges and attorneys debated the implications of the ruling. Some saw it as a dangerous precedent, warning that it could encourage more high-profile defendants to self-represent and challenge court orders. Others viewed it as a positive development, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions must be held accountable. Judge Deirdre Colton, meanwhile, found herself at the center of the storm. Her chambers were flooded with calls from reporters, legal scholars, and even old friends from law school. She declined most interviews, preferring to let her ruling speak for itself. But in private, she couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. She had spent her career upholding the rule of law, and yet, in this case, she had been forced to acknowledge that the system wasn't infallible. The impact of Musk's courtroom victory extended far beyond the legal world. In Flagstaff, Arizona, A 34-year-old mechanic named Marcus Albright watched a clip of the hearing on YouTube. He had never followed a courtroom story before, but something about Musk's calm, measured demeanor struck a chord. Marcus printed the transcript and brought it to his next union meeting, using it as inspiration to speak up about workplace safety concerns. In Sacramento, a 62-year-old retiree named Barbara Levis filed a motion to revisit an old fine from a housing code violation. She cited the Musk case in her appeal, arguing that the penalty had been excessive. To her surprise, the court agreed, and she received a partial refund. Even in the corporate world, the ruling had an impact. Executives and board members began reviewing their own legal strategies, wondering if they, too, could challenge penalties or rulings they felt were unjust. The case became a symbol of the power of preparation and the importance of knowing the rules. For Musk, the aftermath was quieter. He didn't give interviews or make public statements about the case. Instead, he returned to his work, focusing on the projects that had always driven him: space exploration, renewable energy, artificial intelligence. But those close to him noticed a change. He seemed more reflective, more aware of the impact his actions could have. One evening, as he sat in the back of a small cafe off Ashland Avenue, a woman in her late 50s approached his table. She held a to-go cup and smiled gently. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "I just wanted to say, I don't know if I agree with everything you said in there, but I watched it online. And it mattered. The way you handled yourself, it mattered." Musk looked up, surprised. "Thank you," he replied simply. The woman nodded and walked away, leaving him to his thoughts. Back at the courthouse, Judge Colton sat in her chambers, a cup of cold coffee on her desk. Her legal pad was filled with notes, her mind still replaying the hearing. She had spent her career upholding the rule of law, and yet, in this case, she had been forced to acknowledge that the system wasn't infallible. She opened a private memo from the district's legal review board. The last paragraph stood out. While the reduction in penalty was unexpected, it reflects the court's capacity to acknowledge its own limitations in the presence of well-founded legal arguments. This is not a mark of weakness, but a reinforcement of judicial integrity. Colton stared at that sentence for a long time. Then, for the first time all day, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The Musk case became more than just a legal footnote. It became a cultural moment. It reminded people that the system, for all its flaws, could still be challenged. It showed that preparation, precision, and quiet defiance could sometimes be more powerful than money or influence. In a podcast weeks later, a host posed the question bluntly: was this about power or precision? Her guest, a legal analyst, paused before answering. "Precision is power," he said. "It's just quieter. That's what made this so effective." Musk didn't raise his voice. He raised the bar. Years later, the story of Musk's courtroom victory still lingered. Law students studied it, professors cited it, and everyday people remembered it. It wasn't just about a billionaire challenging a fine. It was about the idea that truth and logic could still matter, even in the face of overwhelming authority. For Musk, the case became a footnote in his larger story, a reminder that even the most powerful systems could be questioned. For Judge Colton, it was a lesson in humility and the importance of listening, even when the voice speaking was unexpected. And for everyone else, it was a reminder that sometimes the quietest voices can make the loudest impact.